All right, kind enough to give us a couple minutes here to talk about the attack that happened in New Orleans over New Year's break is Emily Topping. She's a life and culture reporter over for Advanced Local in New Orleans. Emily, Mike Leon, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Emily, I reached out. We were talking about this off air, and I'm sure so many journalists down there have been getting their inboxes flooded with just messages to come appear on programs and things like that and talk about, kind of what has happened down there in New Orleans. So I'm super appreciative, just first and foremost, for you doing that. But I wanted to ask you before we even dive into this, how are you doing personally? Did you know anybody personally affected and what happened in New Orleans? Were your New Year's plans kind of upended given what happened on Bourbon Street?
Thank God I did not know anyone personally that was affected, but I definitely woke up that morning and, called all my friends that were out. I do have a couple of friends that live in the French Quarter that were not there at the time, thank God. But yeah, it's absolutely a terrifying situation. And especially considering the fact that people weren't necessarily identified for several hours. So, I mean, I think the last victim was actually just identified on Saturday, the 4th. So there's definitely been kind of this feeling of unease and having to check in on your people.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny enough, our producer here, William Bales, actually lives in New Orleans too. So kind of one of those things where personally here we had to check on him as well, although he was home safe and sound. All right, so let's get into a little bit of this for a second for our listeners. We were on a break here on the show for a couple of weeks, so this is our first episode back and kind of diving into this. This attack happened for people maybe that don't know the fullest details around it. It happened right around New Year's Eve, going into New Year's Day in the overnight hours on Bourbon Street. Can you kind of give our audience just kind of a high level overview of kind of where the attack took place, victims that you just mentioned, and then also kind of where we are right now up to speed in terms of the investigation process?
Yeah, so initially what happened is on New Year's Eve, or I guess going into New Year's Day at about 3:15 a.m., a big lifted white Ford F-150 truck kind of came off the main street. It went around a police cruiser that had been parked blockading most of Bourbon Street and really quickly accelerated. I don't know if you're familiar with these kind of electric trucks, but it reached extremely high speeds, went about 2 blocks down Bourbon, hitting a bunch of pedestrians and people that were out there partying. It crashed about 2 blocks into Bourbon Street because it hit a big equipment rental truck, at which point the attacker got out with a gun and began shooting people on the street. And he was killed with fire by police officers that were there. So 14 people were killed in total. Initial report said it was 15, but that's including the suspect.
I see. Yeah, I was wondering why it said 15 and now 14. It's so scary. I've seen the images, and the images have been playing for those of us watching on YouTube. As you were talking there at that Royal Sonesta, I've actually stayed at that Royal Sonesta before, a bunch of bachelor parties that I've done down in New Orleans. So super scary and alarming. I'm going to play for you in a second what the police superintendent said about something there. But the next day was the Sugar Bowl, and there's been events, obviously, that are going to be happening over the next month in New Orleans with the Super Bowl coming there. As somebody who's been covering events for this city, how do you think the city handled the preparedness for this? Because you kind of mentioned a little bit about, and for people who haven't been in New Orleans, the streets are very small, right? So a vehicle flying at high rate of speed is going to hit people. And if for people that haven't seen that video of, the unfortunate girl that just went the wrong way and got hit by the vehicle, there's been so many different videos that have come down about that. It's very small and narrow streets. But how do you feel the city not only responded to this, but also how they're prepared for this type of stuff, given the amount of people that were out for New Year's Day and the Sugar Bowl?
Yeah, I mean, as far as a response goes, I think the Sugar Bowl was supposed to be held on January 1st, right? So a couple hours later, they came out and had this press conference and said that they were actually postponing it by a day, which I think a lot of people here were like, that's not enough time. And it was also confusing because initially the FBI and authorities said that they believed that he was not acting alone and that he probably had other accomplices. So it was kind of like, what the hell? You're still going to have this game while potentially there are other people that were involved in this attack still out on the streets. They came out the next day and said that they now believed that he was acting alone. And the reason that they thought that was because several hours before the attack, he had planted 2 separate coolers with explosives on it further down the street. And they captured CCTV of like a random person picking up one of the coolers and dragging it down the street. Turned out to just be like a party goer that didn't know what was in it. But I think they thought that might have been an accomplice. But yeah, it was definitely scary because people are thinking, how can you be so certain that the French Quarter is secure, that there aren't more of these devices around? It just felt a little rushed.
I'm so glad you said this. See, I didn't even know that part about, a party goer taking the cooler. And that's what kind of led to this, which is why I'm so glad we're having you on the program here, Emily, to kind of fill this in because, this is something, again, I've had family that lives there where I mentioned our show producer, like New Orleans is something that I know people that listen to the show. We have a contingent of people that live in New Orleans that listen to this program. So seeing something like that unfold here, and with respect to what happened in Las Vegas with the Cybertruck explosion, there's been so many crazy things that have just happened in the beginning of the year. I wanted to play for you real quick what the police superintendent had said about this person and then kind of ask you a follow-up question. So take a listen to this.
Last night, we had over 300 officers out here. And because of the intentional mindset of this perpetrator who went around our barricades in order to conduct this, he was hell-bent on creating the carnage and the damage that he did.
So you heard a little bit there, and I know the New Orleans mayor had also mentioned about these barricades that are going to be put in place potentially for the Super Bowl as they get prepared for it, but these things weren't out. Can you kind of explain a little bit of, what are these barricades that maybe could have potentially deterred something from that? We kind of talked about how the readiness there, she just mentioned there was 300 officers and there's a video of the officers scrambling to go confront the suspect when this all happened. But back to the preparedness part of this, can you kind of explain a little bit of the barricades and what measures the city is going to do now around high profile events like the Super Bowl upcoming?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about these. They're called bollards. So they're like kind of big metal poles that are stuck in the middle of the street and would theoretically maybe prevent a car from coming in or reaching high speeds. I'm curious if that would have prevented this specifically, because if you watch the video, you can see that he drives a truck around an officer onto the sidewalk. So unless they had those bollards on the sidewalk too, I think it might have been a bit of a moot point. But so they installed these in 2017 after 86 people were killed during the Bastille Day parade in Nice, France. And they had been warned actually in 2019, this was just reported by the New York Times, that the bollards did not appear to work. And this security firm recommended that New Orleans officials fix the barriers immediately, and that the two most likely modes of terror attack were going to be vehicular ramming or an active shooting, which both of those happened. So that's where a lot of this frustration lies, is that they were warned by the security firm in 2019 that this was a possibility. So they were under construction, preparing for the Super Bowl coming up in February. I don't know if they've been down a couple weeks or what, but there was some recent reporting that they're replacing those old bollards with a new form. And there's this kind of safety rating system that ranks how strong they are. The new system is built to withstand 5,000-pound vehicles moving at 10 miles per hour. And this truck that he was driving was 6,000 pounds. And as you can see from the video, he's going significantly faster than 10 miles per hour. So I'm not sure if it actually would have prevented anything. And it's frustrating to know that they were warned that this was something that could happen.
Emily, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, given your title and what you're doing at Advanced Local, but also you can go to emilytopping.com, kind of read some of your articles about this city and some different reporting that you've done on a bunch of different things throughout the city. And the reason why I wanted to have you on was because I feel like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but nobody has like the kind of pulse of the city like you do. You mentioned it a little while ago about people didn't feel like a day's time was enough for Bourbon Street to reopen and the Sugar Bowl to happen. So how is New Orleans doing? When you talk to residents now, when you talk to people, you were mentioning you had some friends that were out in the French Quarter. Like when you talk to folks now, do they feel safe? What is it that they want the public to know about New Orleans and how they're doing?
Yeah, first of all, that's very kind. I would not give myself that title, but that's very nice of you. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a general air of sadness and fear. I mean, today is the first day of carnival season leading up to Mardi Gras. So there's going to be a big parade later tonight. and events going on. I think people have always felt a little wary regarding Mardi Gras, considering just how massive those crowds are. And, you see horrific shootings all the time in the US. Anytime you're in kind of a big crowd, that's something people worry about. Yeah, and I went to Bourbon Street last night and was walking around, and it's sad that the juxtaposition between like this extremely poignant, sad memorial, and then obviously they've reopened it now, so you kind of have tourists walking by with their daiquiris, and you got the neon lights of the strip club like a couple feet away. Yeah, it's kind of hard to reckon those two things, but that's kind of always been part of the spirit of New Orleans, it seems to me, is like that extreme sadness and disaster, along with celebrating life and kind of choosing to celebrate life. I mean, that's why people here have second line parades for funerals, right? And the city has obviously experienced extreme tragedy over and over again. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to reconcile those two things.
Yeah, I agree. I got the image of me with a grenade right now, walking down Bourbon Street right now, and it's just not. And that's a grenade drink for people that don't know. It's a tall drink with a grenade glass. Let's not get nuts here. I did want to ask you before I let you go here, because I know your background. You've been in New Orleans public radio. You've worked for BBC News as a video journalist. So you've asked the questions of elected officials prior to this. So now I want to ask you kind of, what would you be asking, or have you had the opportunity to ask anybody on the law enforcement front, talking to anybody down there sources wise? What are some of the questions that Emily Topping wants to get answered based on what you've been hearing from citizens and residents? You just mentioned Mardi Gras is happening, obviously, in mid-February. You got the Super Bowl before that. So what are some things that not only are you hearing, but you in turn would want to ask law enforcement or the elected officials of New Orleans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to ask what kind of outside security information and help that they're getting, because it's pretty clear to everyone that's a resident of the city that our local authorities are not equipped to deal with most events and tragedies and handling these kind of large scale things. I think a lot of people that lived here when the FBI came in were like, thank God, take it off the hands of the local police department. I mean, our police department is super understaffed. I think between 2019 and 2023, they lost 27% of their officers. There's only about 900 police officers in New Orleans. I would ask what they're doing to up staffing. I also just think people here are worried about general infrastructure for the city. A building like 2 blocks away from me just collapsed about a week ago, and it's the 4th building. Another one just collapsed in Decatur, a couple blocks away from Bourbon Street. And I think people are a little bit worried about what's going to happen for Mardi Gras and the Super Bowl, and if we're equipped to handle this big influx of crowds.
Good to know. EmilyTopping.com. Like I mentioned, you go read all her articles. She does fantastic work over there. Advanced Local is lucky to have you. So thankful for you to come on this program, Emily, and kind of educate our audience about not only what's happening, but I'm glad to hear everybody you know is safe and sound. Continued success to you. Please stay safe.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for having me on.